So the structure today is Ava's going to start by sharing a short presentation about her work. After she completes her presentation, the committee will ask her a series of questions. Her presentation is probably about 15 to 20 minutes. The committee has roughly 30 to 40 minutes to ask questions. And after that point, we'll open it back up to all of you in the audience if any of you have questions. So if you have a question, the best thing to do is just raise your hand. And then at the end, I'll be able to, at least in theory, unmute you and you can ask your question to Ava directly.
And that's
okay?
a digital hand you're raising.
Oh, raise your digital hands because we can't see you. So don't just sit in your room and raise your hand because it'll get really tired. Yeah, raise your digital hand. So if you're not familiar, there's a little hand on the bottom that says raise hand. Okay. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ava to be able to share her screen and talk a bit about her work.
Okay, thank you, Mary. And thank you everyone for attending this. I just want to have a brief moment of acknowledgement to all the people that have helped me get to this point. My committee, my cohort, Nane Alam and Jenna Macy, my friends and family, and the scientists that I've talked to who've helped bring knowledge into this process, and also the land of Hawaii where this research took place. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen. Okay. My work is about the personal and the universal experience of loss due to the climate crisis, shrinking habitats, pollution, extinction, global warming, rising seas. The list goes on. It is the manifold repercussion of the Anthropocene, which is the name given to the epoch where humans are the dominant influence and the determining presence on Earth. The digital format of Zoom is happening because of the pandemic. And I think there's actually a profound connection and parallels between the pandemic and the climate crisis. The connection is that the pandemic occurred and more pandemics are likely to occur because of human influence and interference on the natural cycles of the world and wild animals, the poaching and the displacement of animals, the encroachment and development of lands and habitats, and also that we have created an extremely globalized world that we have yet to fully reckon with. And so, it's really interesting that, on one hand, we are all able to be here because of the pandemic, but that also there are all these sort of like domino effect of repercussions that we have yet to fully understand. And I think that's actually a parallel, and that the parallels of the pandemic to the climate crisis and the Anthropocene are even more powerful because the experience of loss, this tremendous loss due to the pandemic, is still impossible to fully comprehend. We are still in the midst of it. It is still growing and evolving, and its far-reaching repercussions are still difficult to truly fathom. And so we look at numbers, lives lost, livelihoods lost, but the numbers are actually abstract. They enhance that sort of feeling of abstraction and overwhelming. And though they represent an intimate loss in the way they describe loved ones or shuttered businesses, we are all still processing this huge shift in our understanding of life on Earth. And so too with the climate crisis, the Anthropocene. Though science proves the threat is both intimate and universal, that threat is paradoxically rendered abstract. We have these gut-wrenching statistics and scientific projections, and yet because we're in the middle of it, it is impossible to have perspective on it. It's hard to hold it tangibly, even as its effects are already being perceived. And this paradox is at play in my body of work. I am exploring sort of the interconnectedness of life on Earth and seeing myself as an extension of nature. And that's sort of a driving force in my body of work, this idea that the Earth is one continuous living organism. And I like to think of the perspective of the cosmos or astrophysics, in which there's no difference between us as humans and a slug on the floor of the ocean, or for that matter, a rock in the middle of the desert. We are all made up of the same material. We are deeply connected. And in this body of work, I use an expanded idea of landscape. I describe it as an overlaid arrangement of human and non-human life. And so I'm going to show this little video I made that sort of talks about that very broad perspective.
Plants produce oxygen we breathe, and bees and other pollinators, well, they're needed in order to help crops grow, and fungi are needed in order to keep the soil healthy. The scientific consensus is that for every living thing to do well on the planet, including us, the best thing is to have a wide variety of life living on it. Scientists say that species are going extinct at a faster rate than we've seen for millions of years. Why? Humans. We're chopping down trees and clearing land and destroying habitats for farming, houses, and industry. We're polluting our air, soil, and water, and that's having a big impact on all the creatures that rely on them. From illegal trade in wildlife to overfishing and hunting, animals are dying out. Humans move species from one part of the world to another, and that can have a devastating impact on the species that are already there. And adding to all of this pressure is climate change.
So why do I call my work the Atlas of the Disappearing? In my research, I met with climate scientists, geologists, botanists, and biologists. And in one conversation specifically, I asked, where can I find a comprehensive list of disappearing species and disappearing places, something that's keeping track of all these losses? And the scientist I was speaking with said that there's nothing like that, that it's not really something that science does in that way. But then she mused that it would be interesting if there were such a list or documentation. And that's when I had that moment when I was like, this is where art comes in. And art can take this overwhelming concept and express it as an overwhelming concept. The subject can be held in abstraction as a true representation of the experience of that kind of knowledge. In general terms, an atlas is a means of navigation or a method of documentation of place. And my body of work expands on this idea while also being something of an effort in futility. How can you quantify an exponentially growing or changing sense of place? This atlas is a means of guidance via that abstract concept, while also addressing the overlaid arrangements of what comprise landscape. It's both a part of an interior and emotional space, but also an exterior and geographical space. And it underscores the way these spaces are actually embedded in each other, blended together. This atlas documents these landscapes as they are transformed and lost. So duplicity and paradox is a theme connecting all the paintings in this body of work, which are diptychs, or made up of pairs. And I will first talk about this painting, From Above, From Within, Drench the Fires That Chase Us, because it was the first one that I finished in this series. And it was also the longest I ever worked on a painting. It took about 1.5 years. I think of this as a pivotal work for me as a painter, because it was a true exercise in trust and commitment. And I had to lean into the discomfort of the process. And my committee knows this very well. They saw all the iterations. I had to sort of let go into the process and to trust that I had the skills and dedication that were part of my art practice that I could let go into and sort of, and believe that there was an end point. I was wrestling with it in many forms and feeling very unsettled and frustrated in this process. And actually, when I painted the white, when I began to paint the white, I originally thought I was painting over it and starting over. And what was kind of incredible about that experience was that as I started this process of thinking I was going to a place from scratch, I was going to obliterate it. All of a sudden, I realized that the painting was taking its final form. And so also kind of learning to make those assessments in the process and say, wait a second, this is transforming and this is going where it needs to go. And also in the process of making this, I realized that it was reflecting the subject that it was conceptually grappling with. And that was really interesting to me too. So this painting is inspired by the research that I did in Big Sur, California, that was funded by the GSO. I went there to study the way that the climate crisis and the Anthropocene was affecting these landscapes on multiple levels in Big Sur. There's erosion, there's drought, there's wildfire, there's encroachment of development. And while I was there, I was really struck by the impressive, awe-inspiring landscape, the forests with their massive trees, but also the charring, the scar, the fires still smoldering, the smoke lingering in the air. And when I came back to paint, I stretched these two canvases, and they've always been this very disproportionate diptych. And I started painting thinking, you know, I'm not going to have an intention with this work. I'm just going to hold this knowledge in myself and see what happens without trying to drive it, without a final outcome in mind. And so the first iteration of this painting was just a field of greens and yellows, and it was kind of this swampy, foresty feel, but it wasn't resolved. And it just sat in my studio, and I painted a different painting. And then I would go back to it, and at some point, red sort of came across this like very harsh synthetic red, just splayed itself across the canvas. And I talk about it in this sort of like it was doing of its own thing. And that's because I had this experience of sort of letting go into it. And later on, an anthraquinine blue took over. And I find that interesting because it's also a synthetic color. It's beautiful, but it's actually, anthraquinine is used as a bird repellent. So that the sort of paradox of that isn't lost on me. And then later a black sort of took over this sort of charred disruption of the space. And so I realized after this white cloud came over it, and it looked like something akin to smoke, like the lingering of these fires, or the fog. And the fog is really important in Big Sur too, because it is actually what helps the forest sustain drought. And so thinking of these formations that the canvas has taken, it really reminded me of a parallel to the actual circumstance of the landscape, the fires coming over, the starting of the green, and then the ending with these lingering smoky fogs. And then also how, here are some details, how elements of what came before still shine through. And it sort of made me think of the life that sits under the ashes and kind of comes back from underneath. Shadow time and epoquitude. These also were initially inspired by a conversation I had with a scientist who told me that the livable areas on Earth are rapidly shrinking and collapsing, and songbirds are fleeing disease-carrying mosquitoes and escaping to higher and higher altitudes, but that at the same time, the higher altitudes are warming at faster rates. And so even as life reaches desperately higher, the ceiling of livable life is kind of compressing downwards. And meanwhile, the ocean is also warming at a faster rate as it absorbs the heat that's intensifying due to greenhouse gases. And it's also acidifying very quickly as it absorbs the majority of carbon released from fossil fuels. So marine life is plunging even deeper as the waters are rising and inundating livable lands. And so here are just some statistics about livable land disappearing. It struck me that it seems like the abundant earth that we know is collapsing inward at the same time as it's pushing itself apart. And these ideas were the initial inspiration behind this diptych, Shadow Time and Epoquitude. And to emphasize the overlaid arrangements of life, there are also a lot of physical layering. I use the layering of thin washes of paint and of color that are layering over each other to create shadows, implying realms beneath the surface. And I also contrast that tonal layering with areas of tactile and topographical layering, where thick paint and paper collage are drawing attention to the surface. I like that play of perception, the interplay of what moves forward and falls back. And because of the scale of these works, it can shift depending on how close you are to the surface of the painting. So here are examples of some of that physical layering. And just to talk about scale, this is my largest painting to date. And I remember when I proposed this to you guys, to my committee, you were like, that's a big painting. And I wanted to create a scale that would swallow the viewer, to imply that, to also imply that there's a world that extends beyond. And like these canvases are kind of a window to a much broader realm. And I also liked the idea of something huge being made up of tiny moments. So, these paintings, which are 10 feet tall by 14 feet wide, they're actually made up of tiny daubs of paint, torn paper, brush strokes, drawn lines, scrawled words. And this idea embodies the notion that we are one large fabric of life that are made up of tiny fibers. And also the idea of reflection or duplicity comes in to these paintings as well, both because they're a diptych, but also in the theme of motion and water. There's a strong sense of motion here, but in kind of a dissonant way. The forms are both plunging from the sky and also crashing upwards from this watery void. And even the directionless movement is confounding, but there's also a sense of cycling or perpetuity or continuity. And that's something that is attached to the idea of water, that all water on Earth has always been here, that it's the same water continuously transforming, whether it's ocean or sky or fog or sap or blood or snow. It's part of everything and it's part of us. And water is very much invoked in these two paintings, Entangled and Ensnared. And I call these non-identical mirrors because they reflect each other in form and motion, but they also invert each other like mirrors. They are inspired by bodies caught up in vicious ghost nets. And the portrait orientation is also enhancing sort of the bodily form and the allusion to personhood. I think of these as reflective, like that of dissonance and consonance. Both describe a simultaneous or successive sound, but consonance is typically sweet and pleasant and harmonious, and dissonance is unpleasant and harsh. So consonance and dissonance are defined as a structural dichotomy in which they define each other by mutual exclusion. And in this way, they need one another in order to be defined. So the blues in Ensnared, which is the painting on the right, are consonant. They're made up of layers upon layers of thin washes and glazes. The blue tones hold suspended light in the glaze, and they harmonize and create an aesthetic pleasantness. Whereas the reds and greens in Entangled, the one on the left, are more dissonant. The layering of color is actually like complementary colors or opposite colors, and they create a visual tearing of the fibers. This enhances that sort of simultaneous feeling of imploding and exploding that these forms have. They are twisting apart and yet being wrung tightly together. And though they are inspired by underwater spaces, there's almost an extraterrestrial quality to these forms, invoking supernovas like those photographed by the Hubble Space Telescope. So kind of creating a micro and a macro, an underwater and kind of like, outer space feeling. And both paintings have a tension of line and form. The forms are free-flowing and sort of amorphous, and the lines are delicate and yet binding, chaotic, entrapping. The forms, though they're floating suspended upon closer animation, reveal that they are bound by lines. And the lines themselves are sitting on the surface of the painting, drawing attention to the material of painting and demanding to be seen. And I see these paintings as metonyms rather than metaphors. And I use the term metonym in the rhetorical feminist characterization of the word. Whereas metaphors are seen in this regard as a replacement and separation term, metonyms emphasize connections, affiliations, and relativism to reveal a new sense of the self in relation to the expanded network of what comprises identity. And so to me, that correlates to these paintings, and that in Entangled and Ensnared, the viewer becomes both the trapped creature and the entrapping net. So I believe that we are actually mirrors of the landscape, and that the landscape mirrors us, that the lands, the oceans, the skies are flailing, and humanity too is flailing right alongside it, right along with it. And these paintings are a means of navigation and documentation of that. They bear witness to what is being lost and to what is disappearing. This body of work is standing vigil, remembering and mourning these losses, which are real and irreversible. We are losing and have lost species that humans have not even discovered yet, that we will never know existed. And mourning is a type of grief that is useful. It has a purpose. As opposed to melancholia or despair, which can be debilitating, mourning confronts loss. It recognizes that it's real and it changes us. And we need to confront this loss in order for there to be any possibility of moving forward. Art, vitally, offers conceptual pathways of mourning, adaptation, and reevaluation. And I just want to say that my art practice embraces the abstract diametric experience of nature and climate cataclysm to reveal the conjunction of internal emotional landscapes and the external physical world. And I believe that my purpose as an artist is to express the experience of nature as we know it in the present, even as it is being transformed, especially because it is being lost. And that's it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ava. So at this point, I'm going to turn the process over to the committee. The committee has roughly half an hour or so to ask questions. After that point, there'll be some possibility for the audience to ask questions as well. So Deborah, I'm just going to turn it over to you at this point. But unmute yourself.
Yes, I better unmute myself first. So first of all, thank you so much for the presentation. It's been a great pleasure to work with you these past 3 years and to experience your enthusiasm for painting and the growth that you've done as an artist and scholar during this time period. So it's great to see like the work that you've done up until now. And there was a little bit of a glitch in the showing of slides. So I mean, feel free to go back to showing slides if you want to. As you answer questions, if you need to point to specific works to answer the questions, but I think they weren't in like a presentation mode, so the side was getting cut off. Like we were seeing the website name in the top of your screen, but
Oh no.
Yeah, but it's just a little bit cut off, and people can go to the website to see the whole work. But I don't know if that's something when you go back through to answer questions, if you can try presenting it maybe differently and people can get a sense of the work.
Yeah.
A little bit more. I mean, it was almost there. It's just like a little tiny sliver cut off.
Oh no. Okay.
That's okay. That's okay.
I tested it too. Oh.
happen. We're dealing with like, as you mentioned, a pandemic and technologies, and we all have to just account for the fact that like things are a little bit different over the internet than in person.
Yeah.
So you discuss in the paper, in science, through proving the intimacy of the ecological threat, that threat is rendered abstract. I was wondering if you could discuss this statement and the choice to use abstraction as a method for exploring ecological crisis. Like, why specifically abstraction, what it has to do with that statement, and how do you see the abstraction of the issue mirrored in your work? So again, if there's any specific parts of the work that you want to use to point out to answer that question, you can. But why abstraction specifically to talk about ecological crisis?
Yeah, well, I think I feel that allowing the overwhelming aspect of this sort of understand, I mean, it's an understanding that we have kind of in this conceptual realm, but that it is actually abstract when it comes to sort of those intimate places. Like we know these things are happening, but they're happening at a scale that is unfathomable to a degree, especially because we're just these each individual humans with our unique perspectives, that it's really hard to imagine what is happening on a global scale, but also it's unprecedented, kind of like what's happening now, and therefore it's very difficult to sit with these ideas in a way that is tangible. And so to me, that is an abstraction. And then also at the same time, I think of abstraction as sort of speaking to nature on its own terms. Representation is a very human kind of language. And so I feel that abstraction represents more of an approach that allows us to sort of sit with the idea of something without defining it, and then sort of limiting it, if that makes sense. So I think that actually it's really important to have an abstract representation of what's happening alongside the sort of statistical and very like human-oriented language representation of what's happening, because it creates a more well-rounded understanding and experience of what's happening.
And then I just have one more kind of thread off of this related to this, in that up until this point, I've seen you do two really different bodies of work that were happening at the same time that never seemed to exactly come together. And there was one body that was more narrative storytelling, included text, literary in a sense, often on paper. And then there was this other body, which is the abstract painting, which like the black and white one kind of, it came out of that. That was like one of the ones that was happening all the way through, where the other ones are new. So it seems like you brought these two different bodies together for the show, in terms of there is some imagery occurring in the abstract pieces, and there are some texts that are brought in. And I'm wondering about that choice, like how do you choose what stays abstract, what is image-based, and what about readability? You talk a lot about ambiguity. How do you make the choice about how readable something is? How important is it for the audience to read what the images are, what the words are, what the content is of the work?
Yeah, well, that is a good question. And as you know, it's something I have been grappling with since the very beginning. And I think that the work, the sort of in tandem work that is not seen as this body is almost like a way of thinking through these ideas. It's sort of like a way to get out all of the language and sort of the literal aspects of these concepts that I'm exploring, in order to then unleash them in a more abstract place, which feels actually more authentic to where I want to go with this, which is being able to sort of hold this duplicitous idea of the tangible and the disappearing in the same space. And I feel like you can't do that in the constraints of language or sort of literal image representation. However, in the 3 years that I've been exploring this, I realized that there needed to be some signifiers, some clues to lead people into the space, to sort of give them access to this world. And some representation helps. And you know, that was a lot how I came to the idea of sort of the atlas, the navigation of it, or the documentation of it. An atlas kind of helps people fathom something, geography, something that they exist within, but that they also want to be able to understand and navigate and see from a sort of bird's eye view, or from this sort of global perspective. So bringing some of these elements in that are legible helps with that navigation. And I did struggle a little bit with birds, because birds are one of those creatures that people love to see, but also, you know, verge on cliche sometimes. But I thought that, you know, sometimes pushing those boundaries, or embracing them, leaning into them, can kind of be useful. And so to bring an image of birds' wings, and to also interplay that with bats, which is something that people generally don't feel as, you know, warm and fuzzy about. Kind of.
What if people don't read the bats that are there?
That's okay. That's okay. I really think of.
It goes back to like how important is it that the audience read all these different images that you put in?
I don't think that it's crucial that they read everything, but I think it's important that they feel like they have access into these realms. And so far, when people have been seeing these works, they seem to read them all, or to understand those access points. They see the wings. They understand that there's something cloud or vaporous above, that there's this sense of motion, that there's this sort of depth below that is watery. I don't know if I should be showing images at this point, but
you can if you want, if it helps to.
Well, anyway,
you don't have to. It's kind of up to you.
Yeah. Let me just get back to this one. Just first talking about this one, which to a degree has the most access points. I think that, you know, getting back to how important is it that these individual elements are read, to me, it kind of speaks to that idea that there's so much that is unseen in our landscapes that we still need to, we understand that they're there, even though we don't maybe understand all the multifaceted aspects of their existence. And so when you see these works in person, you understand that they're made up of a lot of layers. And those layers are revealed in textures and in overlays. And the fact that I leave some of these birds and these seals legible allows viewers to understand that there's more, and there's a deeper aspect to what these paintings are made up of that maybe they can't see or they can't even read, but there's an understanding that it's there. And so that awareness of the unseen is actually, I think, a really important part of making these works.
Okay, I'm going to pass on to, and we'll keep passing questions around the committee members until we run out of time. So I'll pass on to either Kate or Scott, who wants to go next.
Well, well, I have a question that kind of maybe riffs off of what Deborah was just saying. Is that okay, Scott? Okay, so actually, the first question I was planning to ask is one that you've, I think, answered in the context of your answer to Deborah, which is to talk more about how your work wrestles with the problem of perception, right? How do we make visible things that are too big to see? And I think the theme of the atlas is one way of doing that. You know, I mean, I think you've talked about that. Abstraction is one of your answers to that question. So is layering, and the role of the implied but not fully visible. So instead, I would like to ask you to talk maybe a little bit about the role of place in building this body of work. And of course, place is something which is very specific and local, and your work is confronting problems that are global. But you're not the first student in recent years and previously that we've had who's made art which engages, in very different ways with these kinds of problems of climate change and the environment and rising sea levels and so on, right? So can you talk a little bit about how this place specifically has shaped the development of this work that you've done?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for that question, Kate. I mean, I'd like to first even just say that I would argue that all art is about the climate crisis right now in one way or another, because the Anthropocene is, the epoch of now, which means that humans are the determining presence on Earth. And one of the most transforming aspects of the Anthropocene is the climate crisis. And so if you're making work about romance or your body or, birds and flowers, I mean, it's all really part of this whole of what's happening with the climate crisis. And so I moved to Hawaii from New York City. And, New York City is a place where, as far as the eye can see, the human presence is understood. And I remember thinking that, looking off into the distance, you just see buildings and buildings and buildings. And as somebody who grew up in the middle of the forest, basically, that was really exciting to me. But then after living there for a while, I started to feel depleted, and I came out to Hawaii just as a visitor. And I remember having this incredible revelation that here in Hawaii, the landscape, the land, the earth, the natural forces are the dominating force. And you can be in the middle of Honolulu and you look out between the buildings and you see the ocean or you see the mountains. You feel the wind and you understand that we've built all this structure, but yet the earth and these cycles of the earth and this weather patterns, these are all the more powerful. And so I really think that it gave me this understanding and awareness in a really profound and yet tangible way that, humans are able to change the climate, and yet we're still vulnerable to the changing climate. So that, I think that really underscores what I explore in my work.
Thank you. Scott, you want to?
Yeah, sure. I think I've not heard you say, maybe it's in the paper when I missed it, but you were talking about a metonymy and the way in which you see the paintings as a form of feminist metonymy, which is very interesting. But I wonder, because, and they may very well be that, but I kind of feel like from your paper, you tend to make the paintings more attached to the immensity of loss and environmental, degradation. And I wonder if it might be beyond metonymy at that point and enter into the realm of, obviously you can see where I'm going with this because you write synecdoche, right? Where it really is. I've always seen them more as synecdoche than metonymy. I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it is, and that's a good question. And I feel like all these tropes are maybe a little bit like, it is a murky area to go in, because I do talk about how I'm trying to speak a different language, and then I sit here and try to define it with language. And the reason I chose metonym as the word to describe the way these paintings exist, and the specific feminist rhetorical version or reading of that word. And I'm not sure if there is a rhetorical reading of synecdoche. I like it as a word, but I was seeing metonym, as a way of seeing the interconnectedness. And so in one way, these paintings are symbols of something that is a universal experience. So they are not a replacement, like saying, this cup of water is like an ocean. I'm saying this cup of water is the ocean, and it represents all of the water, and it understands the interconnectedness of identity. So I liked the way that it wove the idea of how we understand an individual in the context of everything that the individual is connected to, if that makes sense. And so, I mean, I did a lot of research after I read this article about, nature as metonym in sort of historical female abstract painters, such as Frankenthaler and Mitchell, and sort of explored, like, what is this metonym? Like, why is this a feminist reading of this language, and how is it different than a metaphor? And I really liked that there was this relativist version of it, that it did not substitute, but instead it incorporated, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I guess I would just follow up. I guess the reason why I asked it, I was actually just a little confused, because it does seem like there's still a slight conceptual leap to with the metonym that I feel almost isn't there with the paintings, right? Because the paintings, it's almost like they are, except for the one issue of them being synthetic, which I think is an interesting dichotomy. So it's just an interesting fold, or an interesting way to see how you're speaking, to hear how you're speaking about these images, which like you said, you iterate this in your paper again and again, we're of nature, we are nature, right? Almost in that sort of drunken Pollock way, which you're not using that language in the way that he was, right? So anyway, I think it's an interesting point to put on how you see these paintings making meaning, and it might be something to continue to refine, because we've talked about this before too. Writing is a huge, like I said, your writing is the painting, right? And so when I would read your descriptions about your paintings in your paper, I thought, well, she just wrote these, she wrote these and then she painted. And that I guess that would be just the follow up with that is that what is the role of writing in your painting, and the sort of, is there a cyclical relationship there in some way, like some sort of water cycle in a way?
I mean, I love that idea. I think so. I mean, I think, you know, I included poetry in my walkthrough video, and I actually was playing with the idea of including more, but it just would have gotten so long, because the poetics and the lyricisms that I do talk about in my paper, but I haven't talked much in this presentation. There is that, it is an expression of emotion that is very human, and the descriptions, like the words themselves hold a lot of personal meaning for me in how I process the world and how I relate my own sort of internal landscape to the external. And so to me, there is lyricism in this abstraction that is directly linked to the lyricism of the poetry that I write and the words that I write. And I do think it is a reciprocal relationship, because I will write and then paint and then write and then paint. And it is this sort of, without an intentional relationship, like I don't think I'm gonna paint the poem or I'm gonna write the poem about the painting. But I know that, kind of just like all of these sort of diametric or diachronic cycles that are happening in the world, that's one that is just very intimate to me and personal, that is continuously happening. And I mean, for me, the exciting thing about this body of work is that, kind of as you were saying, Scott, there's a lot more to explore here, and there's a lot more to push into and unravel. And I really see this body of work as like a starting point for that exploration.
So
Cool, thanks.
I got the message from Mary. We just have about, and that was a little bit ago, we just have about 10 minutes for the panelist questions. I'm wondering if we can do one more round, but ask fast questions, like ones that are maybe one sentence answers, just to give everybody one more shot at around the questions. And so my question is about the importance of scale in your work. Like, we talked about this quite a bit. Like, I guess the piece is 14 by 10 feet, is that right?
Yes.
And originally it was going to be 21 feet by 10 feet. And there was just some space issues for pulling that off. So the plan was to do this big painting. And then the pandemic happened and everything was going online or becoming digital for the actual thesis show. And then there was some reconsideration about, you know, do you scale down, because people are going to be seeing it on their phone, on their computer. They're not going to be seeing a 21-foot scale. So I just was wondering if you could talk about the importance of keeping the large scale as this format went digital, and how you're dealing with this kind of digital presentation of the large painting.
Yeah, that is a good question, and it's one of those that I feel like I'm still processing, which is, you know, thematic of my work. But, you know, I mean, even going back to that idea of understanding unseen realms, to me, just like the layering is so important, even if the layering isn't something that people can visually understand. To me, the scale was also very important in my relationship to the artwork. The fact that painting this overwhelmed me. You know, I had to get on a ladder. I had to like wrestle with the canvas and flipping it and turning it. And it was this really important physical relationship that I had with the work that made, I think, transformed what came about. I think that the scale was deeply impactful on the way that these works evolved. And I don't think, in fact, I know that they would not look anything like they do now if I had tried to scale it down.
And luckily, at some point in the process, you were offered the Commons Gallery show. So yeah, that will give a chance for people to see them in person. What are your dates again for the show?
The dates are, it opens on April 13th and runs until April 27th.
Okay. And then quick questions from Kate, Scott.
I don't know if I don't know if I can ask a quick question. I was going to ask you a bit about one of the problems with discussing ecological change and loss is that some losses are easier to make people care about than others, you know, so you have sort of the charismatic megafauna problem. Everybody wants to save the whales, nobody wants to save the mosquitoes, you know. And so, and one of the things that I've really enjoyed about this body of work that you've done for your thesis is how beautiful a lot of it is, right? And I think sometimes we kind of denigrate beauty a little bit in thinking about some of the things that art should do. But a long time ago, when you were first starting on this process, I remember you saying that you wanted in some way to use the aesthetic qualities of your art to kind of help draw people into this problem that your art is about. And so I guess a short answer, is that still happening?
I think so. I think so. I mean, I guess I struggle with not creating painting. I find myself hard pressed to make paintings that I don't aesthetically respond to personally, you know? And you know that this blue color that's even in the background, that's kind of thematic of my work throughout the whole time. It's something I'm drawn to, but yes, I do think that these works hold an element of subterfuge in which they kind of draw people in with a seemingly aesthetic beauty, but then reveal kind of the darkness that is underlying there. And I think that that's a really important element of experiencing this present moment, which I talk about. Like, the present is transforming, and we're aware of the fact that it's transforming. And so even seeing, you know, a beautiful mountainscape, or, you know, spending time in this amazing ocean water that we have in Hawaii, there's this awareness. And the more that you spend time in those places, the more you become aware of the way they're transforming, and, you know, the way they're being inundated with plastic pollution in the water, or, you know, that species are dying out. You know, where I grew up, there are those, you know, the plights of, you know, tree species dying out, and you'll see the brown sort of shadows on the hillside. You know, there are these reminders when you pay attention. So I'm trying to lure people into paying attention, so that they see the true depths, abstract though they may be.
Thank you.
Okay, one last question. I'm curious about a couple of things. That, for one, you've talked about the bird, right? The bird was a challenge for you to use that trope, right? For a number of reasons. But other tropes too, you insist on there's a constant dichotomy, right? A constant binary, a dualism almost, maybe. And so I wonder about why that polarity is necessary in your work.
Well, to try to keep it to a short answer, I mean, that's like a amazing question that I feel like I could talk for hours about. But I mean, I'll just limit it to like that idea of humans as nature and nature as other. Like, that is a dichotomy that is impossible to ignore. And I try as I might writing my thesis paper, you know, like I kept saying, you know, we are losing nature, but wait a second, we are nature. And it's really hard to even talk about nature without separating it as an other. And so, like, to me, that's fascinating and so emblematic of one of the crises of our times. Like, this, we are an extension of something that we can't even talk about without othering it, you know? And so, yeah, that I think that is an inherent duplicity that is extrapolated in so many ways that I try to explore in my work.
So maybe it's the dupe. It's like the dupe, the duplicity. Maybe
Yes.
That's the answer.
Yes.
Because the binary opposite is duplicitous.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
That was my third question, so thanks, Scott, for asking. That's the one I didn't get to. So we all have similar questions here to ask you, so that's great. We got through. I think the major ones we had. The way this process is going to work is Mary Babcock is going to call on people according to their digital hands being up. I think that Wendy Kawabata was the first person to raise a digital hand, and then we'll go through as many as we have time to in the order they come up. So thanks again for the presentation. So it's great seeing things come together in this way. So we'll see what the audience has to say.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Ava. So again, just raise your hand and then I can allow you to talk, but you're going to need to unmute. And we are so lucky that we have so many people here because I think of it being virtual. But just respectfully, if somebody already asked the question you had your hand raised for, if you can put your hand back down, that will also facilitate things a little bit. So Wendy, you should be able to just unmute yourself and ask the question.
Okay, thank you. Ava, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, hi, Wendy.
Okay, great. Congratulations.
Thank you.
As you guys were talking, and the sort of overarching topic of the Anthropocene and the connection of us to the natural world and othering, it brought to mind for me the idea that a number of people think, which is that we're actually now post-Anthropocene. And Timothy Morton wrote about it as the idea of the hyperobject. So, you know, say petroleum or plastic is a hyperobject because it's everywhere and it's so present that it actually has greater force than we do or that nature does. So I wonder about that, the centering on the Anthropocene and any connection foreboding to the post-Anthropocene and the role of synthetic media in your work. And then also I'm kind of wondering about, you know, you talked about the first painting that you showed with the large white gestural strokes, and that when the white first was laid down, it was to wipe out the painting. And so you obviously have a really intuitive process for painting, which not all abstraction is intuitive. So, and you may have partially covered this, I think, in it with between yourself and Scott, but I do wonder about that. You know, your really intuitive process, and then your proposed content or your proposed subject matter. How do you negotiate that painting is a reflection of Big Sur when that's not how it starts out? How do you negotiate that? So one observation kind of question and then a question.
Yes, yeah, thank you, Wendy. Maybe I'll try to do this in reverse order.
Okay.
Yes, my relationship with painting is very intuitive. And as you know, I'm also a drawer, and and as a writer too, I feel those mediums for me are much more intentional and maybe a little bit more goal-oriented, or have an idea of what the end product is. Whereas with my abstract painting, I keep myself in this sort of subliminal almost realm. And with something like Big Sur, it's like I gather all this knowledge and I hold it within me and then trust that it influences my work in a way that I will only know through making the work. I remember first semester of MFA in Mary's methods class, she said that art is a way of bringing new knowledge into the world. And I feel like that intuitive relationship I have with painting is an expression of that. You know, it's just taking, you know, metabolizing this and then letting it come out in this way that is a form of discovery. And yes, I love Timothy Morton. I love his ideas of hyper objects. And, I think of Earth as an organism in which everything is connected, whether it is human-made materials such as plastics, or the very core of the Earth, which has been there since the beginning of time. So I think of hyper objects as another way of understanding sort of the interconnectivity, and that we are all made of this same material, even though it can seem so like diametrically different. And I think that using synthetic material, which is something that I've given a lot of thought to, is another expression of that paradox. It is a beautifully illustrative way of showing some of these paradoxes, is creating sort of this abstract language of nature using something that we think of as being very, very opposite of nature, which is plastic. And yet you could say that all things that are made on this earth are of this earth. So I really like playing with those ideas, and I like that people ask me those questions, because to me that shows that I am bringing up all of that kind of content. So thank you for asking.
Yeah. Did you ever consider milk paint or, other painting materials that?
I have considered using like nature, or, again, nature, like things that like more plant-based, or, something that is accessible, and, making depictions of nature with nature. But as I said, I'm leaning into sort of the paradox of using a synthetic material to create content that explores this wilderness or this natural phenomenon, and then sort of addressing that idea that like all things made on this earth are of this earth. So even this plastic that we think of as being so another kind of other, is still more similar to us from the perspective of the cosmos.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So Claire, it looks like you have a question.
Hi, Ava. Can you hear me?
Yes, hi, Claire.
Congratulations, this has been fabulous. It's been really interesting to hear you talk about the intellectual side of things here, but I would love to hear you talk a little bit about the physicality of actually making these paintings. They have a really expressive gesture and presence, and they're just really big. Can you talk about what that process was like and how you approached them materially?
Sure. Yes. That is the fun part. I mean, when I made these large canvases, it was intimidating, like a blank canvas. It's exciting and intimidating at the same time. And just knowing that like I couldn't even reach the top, that I actually had to get on a ladder or, flip the painting in order to reach different parts. And I basically just start with color. I start by covering the canvas with color and then responding to that. It's almost like I need some shred of something in order to start building that responsive, sort of intuitive approach to making art. And so I knew in the back of my mind that I was exploring sort of that idea of the compressing habitable land, the idea of like sort of the skies pressing in and the water pressing up, and just sort of like this almost stratification of our place on Earth. And so there is some of that explored in the content. But what I will say that really shifted everything for me, especially in Shadow Time and Apoquitude, which I guess I can share one more time, is that the incorporation of collage. So I actually have, cut out or torn out shapes of birds, bats, and seals that are placed and embedded into this into the painting itself. And when I decided that I wanted to use collage, because of the scale of the work, it's not like I could just like cut them out of a magazine, like traditional collage or a newspaper. I actually had to make the pieces of the collage from scratch. So I had to, make these bird forms, blow them up digitally, print them out huge, and then place them on the canvas. So I was actually working with these like really big, unwieldy paper collage pieces, which actually kind of fun in a way, it felt like being, small in a giant world to a degree. And so that could make the scale of these collage pieces work with the scale created by these canvases. And then a lot of it is just intuitive mark making too. I use drips and splatters, and it's almost like I have an out of body experience when I'm painting. I just lose time. I like come to at the end of a few hours, and all of a sudden there are all these marks made on the canvas, and it really is responsive. And I think when I started incorporating collage, that's when it really came together. Before that, I felt like I was really struggling, just sort of putting paint down and color and scrawling words into the paint. Which I stopped using words for poetic content, but more just for visual representation of language, and sort of, so they're not legible. They just sort of read as other elements embedded in this topography. But yeah, it was exciting when the collage started happening, because that's when I felt like everything started to make sense. And then in this painting, I also did some excavation too, some rubbing away of areas to reveal what was underneath, which was also kind of an exciting practice. So, okay, I'll stop sharing. Thank you for that question. It's fun to talk about.
I'm sorry, Anna, if you want to unmute.
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
I like you're at the bottom of the ocean.
I'm calling in from the bottom of the seas. Sorry, okay, I think I fixed the echo.
It's good now.
Ava, beautiful, beautiful presentation and beautiful work that I'm very excited to see in person. I was just curious if you could talk a little bit about the titles, especially of the large works, Shadow Time and Epochtitude. I feel like you spoke a little bit about how the titles were generated for your other works, but I'd love to hear more about these specifically and really what those terms mean to you.
I can hear City in the background.
Yes, and a very, very curious 8-month-old also would like to know.
Thank you, Anna. Yes, good question. Yes, the Shadow and Epochtitude are both terms that are from this public participatory art project called the Bureau of Linguistic Reality. And they are, the project is about giving language and terminology to the current times, the age of the Anthropocene, the age of the climate crisis, and shadow time. And I do think I talked a little bit about this, but I didn't specifically relate it to shadow time, but it's that duplicitous experience of understanding that there are more than one time frames taking place. And so the idea that, we're both experiencing nature even as it's being lost. And Epochtitude is kind of along the same lines, but Epochtitude is the idea that there have been countless epochs before us, and there will be countless epochs after us, and that the earth will continue to revolve around the sun, whether or not we destroy everything that we know, we will not destroy this earth. And so it's kind of a like, optimistic nihilism, which is a term I've used before, but, that idea that in the scheme of things, humans are very important to humans. And, for better or worse, we're very important to all life forms on Earth as we know it right now. But, we're not gonna, we destroy the planet as we know it, but we don't destroy the planet. And I also like to think a little bit about, it's kind of a very, very sad thought, but the idea that we live in this planet that is so tremendously abundant and so full of a variety of life that it's allowed us to be able to thrive so fully and to be so successful in thriving on this planet as a species, that we've actually, because of its abundance and because of that ability to thrive, we have the ability to destroy this very earth as we know it that brought us to this place. So yes, those titles are both very important to me. So thank you for that question.
Well, thank you. I think at this point, we're going to need to close. That what will happen next is when we end the webinar, the committee will meet to evaluate Ava's work. I have a couple times put out in the chat our advertisement for both the virtual MFA show and also Ava's upcoming show in the Commons Gallery. So we hope if you haven't had a chance to check out the virtual MFA show that you spend some time with it because there's the really rich work. So I want to thank everybody for participating today, and best to all of you. And we have a second defense coming up at 1 p.m. for an NA alum, and then at 2:45 for Jenna Macy. So we hope that you join us for those as well. So thank you. Thank you, Ava.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ava. Thanks for everybody for coming too and supporting Ava in this. Thank you.
Okay, well, I guess I'll just